Welcome to night 2 of Claire House's Community Conversation Series. We are so happy that you made time to be here tonight for what we hope will be a fruitful, reflective conversation for you. We have so much fun doing this and really love the opportunity to share some thoughts and experiences that maybe you don't get a chance to think about or talk about on a very regular basis. I am Kelly Scott. I'm the executive director and founder of Claire House. I have been a nurse for almost 39 years.
You're old.
Still hard to wrap my mind around that
Wise.
sometimes. But I have, throughout my career, I have always gravitated towards those people that weren't getting better. From the time I was a new grad and I was 21 years old working on a bone marrow transplant unit in Oklahoma City, that was always where my heart was at the bedside of not the ones that were getting cured and going home, but the ones that weren't getting better and were struggling with end of life. I don't know why I had that comfort level from a very young age, but I've met so many people through this work that have that same comfort level. And it's a really strong kinship and a lovely, lovely thing to be a part of. We have been doing this work in the Tulsa community for 21 years at Claire House. Formed a project in response to a growing need for caregiver help in final days care. People that didn't want to be in a nursing home or an institution but didn't have the family support to be able to stay at home because end-of-life care gets pretty rough towards the end, and those final weeks of life can be very demanding physically, emotionally, spiritually, socially, financially, all the ways that it becomes really, really difficult to provide care in those final days. And hospice is a wonderful service. It is probably the best managed care system that Medicare has. It provides a team of professionals to visit people in their homes and take care of their needs in an intermittent basis. So a nurse, a social worker, a home health aide, a chaplain, they're all visiting your home. They're providing medications and durable medical equipment and support, education, teaching, and some hands-on care. The nurse is really focused on managing symptoms and managing the medication regimen and helping with pain control and teaching about the dying process and all those milestones. But the bottom line is they come and they go, and they don't stay around the clock. And a lot of families don't realize this until they find themselves in a devastating end-of-life situation, and they realize that the end is coming and it's going to be upon them to provide that care and support their loved one through the end. At the same time that they're going through the worst time of their lives as well as they're saying goodbye to someone they love. So we didn't have a solution to that in our society, and Claire House became that solution in our community. A small group of people envisioned this idea to create something that was just a home and the care. Not a hospice, not a medical provider, not a clinical environment, but just home and care for people who needed extra help at the end. We started that project in a very small space in a rented apartment, and we grew from there. It was a new idea in this community, an innovative model. People didn't understand what we were doing. Hospices didn't understand how we would work together. So we had to make it up as we went along and teach the community how we could make this thing work. From day one, we've always been a free service. We're not licensed or regulated by the state health department. We don't have to be because we don't charge for care. And it's kind of a win-win. Despite the fact that we have to raise a heck of a lot of money every year, the fact that we're out from underneath that somewhat oppressive environment of the healthcare system, out from under regulations, gives us the freedom to do what we want to do and need to do to give the best care possible. And so everything that we have and we give is trying to help people live the best that they can for as much time as they have and really make the most of every moment. So in making this up and making this work, we introduced this model within our state, and since then have been a part of spreading the model. So we believe that every community should have a home like Claire House. that while lots of communities have hospice programs, not many of them have what we call a social model hospice, which is filling that gap in what hospice provides. We're not a hospice provider, we're an end-of-life care home. And we enable hospice to do what they do very well, and they enable us to do what we do very well. We're not a standalone service. Everybody that lives with us has to be enrolled in a local hospice program who provides all the medical oversight, that interdisciplinary team of providers, and we work collaboratively with them to provide the best possible experience for patients and families. So we believed from the beginning that the model was replicable, that it was something that any community could do if they just had the willpower and the know-how to do that. And now we devote a huge portion of our mission to educating others through events like this to help people understand what's happening at the end of life, what decisions need to be made, how to navigate the system, how to be the best possible caregiver, and know what resources are out there. In addition, we do a lot of teaching in formal institutions, so nursing schools, medical schools, social work, family and what's that called? Family science. I can't remember the name of that program, but human and family development, I think.
At OSU, yep.
At OSU. Mm-hmm. Social work, chaplaincy. Mm-hmm. We host students from all kinds of disciplines in our home and through lectures and classes that we do on their campuses. And the third piece of that is that, again, we believe that every community should have a Clare House, and we freely spread our model across the country. So we've been a part of developing 4 additional homes in the state of Oklahoma, as well as mentoring countless projects throughout the nation. We founded the Omega Home Network, which is a national organization of homes like Clare House, and we have over 100 members in, I think, 32 states across the country. So this model is growing and spreading as more and more communities understand the need. I think one of the most affirming things about this process is that in the beginning and starting Clare House, I couldn't find a model like what I envisioned. And so we just kind of moved forward on our own and, as I said, made it up as we went along. But as time went on and internet searching got more sophisticated, we began to locate other homes that are even older than us, 30 years old, 35 years old, saw the same problem in their community, envisioned the same solution, and worked their fannies off to make it happen. And to find these homes and connect with them and say, oh my gosh, we're doing this too, and then meet them, make site visits with them, and get them to be a part of forming this network has been some of the most invigorating, satisfying work that you can imagine. To see people across widely varying communities make something work and the model be so consistent and unique when we never even had contact with each other until the last 7 years. So it's been quite a journey. Tulsa's been a part of and a major supporter of something really special, and I think we can all be proud to be a part of this community that gives so much love and compassion and provides so much care to people at their most vulnerable time. I want to hand it off for a minute to Jennifer Clark, who is my favorite partner in crime.
We're dangerous together, as you will find out. For those of you who I don't know, I know many of you, but some I don't. My name is Jennifer Clark. I am a hospice and palliative medicine physician. I've been practicing for 25 years, so I'm not nearly as mature as Kelly is.
Oh, that's rude.
She's much older, wiser.
Your hair is grayer, though.
This is true. Yeah, a blessing of having a Celtic heritage. I have been in Tulsa for about half of that period of time, and I met Kelly and was part of the Clare House family, I think, like not even a week into the first week I set foot on these grounds. And have been really interested in the innovative approach to end-of-life care, filling gaps that Kelly so eloquently talked about. One of the other beautiful things that we've been able to see over these 2 decades that we've been serving the community is that we're changing the social fabric of what we fundamentally believe in. We pulled death out of the closet and started talking about it as a common human experience. not only about death and dying and normalizing those experiences, but also now in our, kind of upcoming 2 decades that we're facing now, is really thinking about how does this inform life and living, and how do we help really grow a death-aware community? Because as you will see, when we have a sense of our own mortality, or the fancy scientific term for it is mortality salience, we tend to live better and treat each other with grace and dignity. And so a lot of the education we now do for the lay public is this kind of stuff, really talking about what this really means on a Tuesday afternoon in Tulsa, Oklahoma, and how it can inform how you live your life to the things that really matter most. So hopefully you will enjoy. A little bit of just housekeeping things. First, little summary from last week for those of you who weren't here, and to orient you to the program. This year, we were asked to kind of be direct and upfront with what are the things you guys get asked the most? Like, what are the most compelling questions that your guests and families, volunteers, and others ask you when you're at the bedside, or students, And so last week we tackled these 3 questions. First one being, why is it taking so long? Which is a very common question, and understanding how dying and death are both processes that have to unfold in their own time. Those were coupled with a couple of, other kind of discussions. The second question was, why did mom wait till I left the room? So if you're interested in those questions, along with, should I gather my family now? Is it now? Is it now? Right? We recorded it, and it is actually going to be uploaded, if not already uploaded, to the Clare House website. So if you wanted to listen to it and understand how tonight's conversation fits in, we'll tackle another 3, but those are the ones we tackled last week.
And we are recording tonight as well.
Yeah. So this does 2 things. We'll make reference to both of these books. So this would be your opportunity to take your phone out, get your resources, and then promptly turn your phones off or put them away, please. These 2 resources, I will tell you, have profoundly impacted my life over the last 2 years. The one on the far side is from Pema Chodron. She's a beloved Buddhist nun. How we live is how we die. She does a beautiful job of marrying the Buddhist tradition around what we call the bardo. We'll talk about that a little bit later, with Western experience. And then this one, I'm still not sure what to do with this, and we'll talk about that later today, is Lucid Dying by Dr. Sam Pernia, who is an intensivist. So he's an ICU doctor up at NYU School of Medicine, but he's a super specialist in advanced resuscitation. And as part of that work, he studies what we call recalled experiences of death. And so profound works that I would recommend everybody read. Anything else you want to add to that?
Nope. Let's go.
Before we move on, we want this to be a little bit of a dialogue. For those of you last week, any other burning, lingering questions before we move into new stuff? So the question is, which one would we recommend first? It doesn't matter, because they talk about, you will see it's really interesting. It's like an East meets West, really. So it doesn't matter, whatever draws to you. Pema's lovely. I mean, she's just a lovely human being. So if you need something sweet, read that. Sam is an intensivist in every way, shape, or form of that word. You hear him talk, you hear him write, you hear him. So if you want to know hard science, he's the guy to go to. But you will be surprised with some of the very sacred words he uses in the care of his patients. So, okay. Well, this will be a discussion tonight, like we did last week. So we'll kind of talk about things, maybe do a couple little fun spiritual exercises or something. But we'll always leave room for questions and answers after each of the sections. So, first question: what is happening? Is it the drugs?
So, very common situation when family members maybe aren't understanding what a dying person is manifesting in their behavior, and maybe that person themselves is not quite sure about what's going on. And I want to start talking about a book that we have embraced for decades in the hospice movement called Final Gifts: Understanding the Communications of the Dying. I see heads nodding. I know a lot of you have read it. It was written by two hospice nurses. After decades of experience, they compiled their stories together and came up with some basic framework of how dying people symbolically communicate. Because in this culture, it's been in the closet. It's not been something we're taught to discuss, not been something that is a topic of conversation over the dinner table or in schools. And we don't really have language for talking about the actual experience of dying. And what we tend to do in lieu of that is to speak symbolically. And these nurses outlined several different themes or motifs that came through in these symbolic languages. So the base of their theory is that as death draws closer, as the human psyche, soul, mind retreats and withdraws inward, which is a normal part of that process of readying oneself for death. It's one of the pieces of work of dying. The physical world becomes less prominent and that interior work becomes more prevalent. And as that happens, the veil between the spiritual world and the physical world thins. And so people are moving back and forth with one foot in each space. And they experience those things in what I certainly believe is a very real way. And family will frequently hear things coming out of their loved one's mouth that seem very confusing, and their go-to thought is it's the morphine, or they're hallucinating, or they're demented, but not really seeing it as a true, valid experience that someone is relating what they're seeing or feeling, but that there's something outside that's causing that. And the consistency of these themes has really upheld this belief that this is a real experience, because one of the most common themes that you'll hear people talk about is travel, a theme of travel, and that they have to prepare. They're getting ready to go on a trip. They need to get their tickets. They've got to renew their passport. They've got to pack their bag. Can you help them call a cab? All kinds of imagery around travel and moving. And I mean, really, how symbolic could that be? That's what they're doing. They're preparing for a journey. Another one is seeing something that's beautiful, light, a garden, imagery, colors, whatever that might be, but being able to visualize something that we also in the room cannot see. And then a really common one is being visited by people who have died already, being able to see a loved one, have a conversation with a loved one. Some of the most poignant experiences of that is watching a woman hold a child that we can't see, that died in childbirth or early in life, and see that person cradling and singing to that infant. That visitation from loved ones is incredibly common. Lots of conversations that may be going on between the person who is dying and those spirits that are now gathering to help them find their way to that next place. And when all of these things are happening, if we are able to help everyone around understand that, don't discount this as a side effect or as some sort of physical manifestation of the disease necessarily, but to see this as the gift of communication from the other side that can be reassuring, can be comforting, could be scary, could be traumatic. But how do we unpack that, and how do we get someone to be in a comfortable space to witness that? It may be that when we try to ask questions and get it clarified what's going on, the dying person will shut that down, because it's such a personal experience, because it's difficult to step outside themselves again and be in relationship with the physical world, or because maybe they just don't feel like it will be understood. But we teach people to try to accept those statements and gently probe with, can you tell me more about that? What does it look like, what you're seeing? Just as gently as possible, try to explore that further with them without discounting in any way what they are experiencing, whether we can experience that or not.
I'll add a couple things. What term we're going to be introducing tonight is a thing called the gray zone of death. You wade into it like the ocean, and you wade into it with your family and the loved ones that are close to you. And so we as bystanders are also walking into that space, and will often be flooded with some of these feelings as well. Like memories will come up, emotions will come up. And because we're neurobiologically intertwined, particularly the closer we are, whether biologically or otherwise, we will be experiencing some of those things too, because in addition to the patient in the bed that is actually going through the dying process, you are wading into that space with them until that point of no return. And so that thinness of the veil also applies to you. And when we talk to families about that experience, just the other day, I was with a mother and her daughter, and we were talking about this, and she just became gobsmacked. The daughter was like, "Are you kidding?" I'm like, "No." She goes, "Well, that explains it." She goes, "The other night I was sleeping. And I woke up suddenly, and my mom was sitting right next to me." So this is a woman who's actively dying at Clare House. It hasn't crossed the official threshold into the other side, but was able to visit her daughter and assure her that she was going to be okay. So this thinness, this experience of the mystery, whatever word you want to call it, we oftentimes, when you say the word spirituality, oftentimes people's hackles get up because we don't want to confuse it with religion. The spirituality is this essence of who we are, this interconnectedness of being human. So regardless of faith tradition, from secular all the way up to the most, orthodox, everyone has this spiritual essence about them, the mystery, the creative part of the world. And we get closer and closer to it during the dying process, as we do during the birthing process. And so always welcoming families to participate in that, because they're being welcomed whether they understand it or not. Go ahead.
Well, and as people spend more and more time in that very thin space, time constraints also can fall away. And they can be floating across the continuum of their life. And again, that can be good and feel inspiring, and it can also be traumatic. And sometimes part of that is revisiting some tough stuff that's happened. And it's really distressing as a caregiver to see when someone is reliving a very difficult experience and knowing that we can't fix that. Do you want to talk a little bit about that trauma?
Yeah.
Especially and with veterans, I think it's something that you see with people that have experienced combat before and lived that life.
Yeah, I don't want to discount that the complications, medical complications nowadays, people are living with really complex medical illness. We do see hallucinations, true hallucinations at the end of life. I don't want to discount that. That does happen. And it's our job as end-of-life care providers is to suss out, okay, are we dealing with hallucinations related to kidney failure or sometimes drugs can do that. But most of the time, the topics that we're talking about is what Kelly's talking about, is people kind of saying, hey, you know, grandma came to visit last night, or they're rocking a baby. It's like, what is going on, right? So differentiating that. One of the things that Kelly touched on, and we'll talk about here in a second, is during the recalled experiences of death, we know that everyone undergoes a life review. So, you know, my life flashed before my eyes kind of thing. It's the rudimentary basis for a lot of our large religions to have Judgment Day. This is what it means, is that your life, the way they describe it, the sensory experience, is that you experience your entire life in minute detail, not only from your viewpoint, but also from the viewpoint of the people that you have touched. So you feel your emotions, you feel their emotions, and you see the domino effect of your decisions. Everyone's like, holy smokes, I'm not sure I want to die, right? But the people that come back and say, even in the most humiliating, shameful, painful, difficult experiences and reliving those, there was so much profound compassion from that standpoint, because we become much bigger than the constricted sense of self that's contained within this body. But there is trauma, particularly trauma that has not been addressed. Arguably, all of us are walking around with a little bit of that. And one of the things that dying can teach us is this life review piece of things, that there is universal moral and ethical code around being kind and compassionate to people. And if we don't cultivate and understand how we have harmed or have been harmed in the past, those things will come up to be processed. And so many of the things we deal with are bringing historical narrative that have been pushed way far down into the psyche, into the present, so that the person is whole, fully whole, when they're ready to move on. As many of you have heard me say, I often share, stories, and symbolic stories are really helpful for us to understand these experiences. And one of the most profound stories I heard from a patient who was a Native American woman who said, oh, yeah, we do that life review thing. She's like, we call it shards work. And I'm like, shards work? And she's like, yeah. She's like, across our lifetimes, when we're faced with emotional, difficult circumstances and we're not wise enough, not mature enough to handle it, a part of us, a shard of us, gets left in the past. And it's our job during this lifetime, when we have the capability and capacities, to go back and pick up those shards of us in the past and bring them forward. And if we don't do that in life, death will do it for us, so that our spirit is whole in all of its glory, good, bad, and ugly, to go on to its next iteration, its next becoming. And she was very clear that they use the word shards. They are pointy, they are sharp, they're hard to handle, and they hurt when they get reincorporated. So we don't want to discount that this is all not fuzzy and lovely and la la la. It is what we call the terrible sublime. It is honest. It is the most authentic experience that I think we can consciously live through if we are prepared for it. And you only can do that if you're living towards the experience and creativity that dying brings to your life.
And we honor that as sacred.
Yeah. We have a story to share.
So, a lot of that, who you've lived, the life you've lived, is very much a part of that dying process. And we see that play out in those final days of life. And this is a story about a woman named Rita who was in our home for almost 2 months, and she just could not die.
She tried.
She wanted to.
Oof. Several times.
She really wanted to. She was tired. She didn't understand why she was still there. And we didn't really either. She was not eating much, if anything. And
3 weeks, man.
She was one of those that just hung on and hung on and hung on. So our caregivers, we are blessed so much with the caregivers that we have in our house. And these, for the most part, are people that have come to this work and learned in the home and understood what people need and put themselves in this very vulnerable space where hard things happen every day. And one of our caregivers figured out a way to help Rita. And so Courtney's here tonight, and she has written this experience up for me, and I'm going to read it to you. We had seen her sitting up or leaning forward while gripping her bed rails for a while. I learned she was a truck driver and recognized the behavior and used the Roku to bring up YouTube. I searched truck driving ASMR and would talk to her as if she was starting a haul. Later, I would go back to the room and tell her she had hit her hours and needed to pull over for a mandated rest. She would go through the motions of pulling the truck over and then would relax and let me lower the head of her bed and sleep. My aunt and uncle were truck drivers for a while, so I just simulated the experience when her medication didn't have much effect. This was after she had stopped most cognizant communication with us, but was still exhibiting her strong habits from life. I looked at the notes from that chart today, and Courtney had documented that Rita was lying in bed, steering and pulling on the gears and doing all these things. And reading through the rest of the notes, it was about 32 hours later that she died. Thank you for sharing that with us. I think it was a gift to her to be perceptive enough to understand what might give her some peace, what might connect her back to what felt familiar and comfortable, and really helped drive her home.
Literally.
Yeah.
So the question, I want to make sure I heard it, is end-of-life experience different depending on your faith tradition, if you don't believe in an afterlife? Is that what I heard you say? So some of the science, so in lucid dying, along with final gifts and along with life after life, everybody who studies near-death experiences will tell you it doesn't. The only science, so it's odd, right? So the only thing that we see in the what we call kind of the life review piece of things and the anticipatory planning of things that Kelly was talking about, it may have flavors of that. Like I talked to Jesus today. Kind of, so you may have flavors of those things that are informed by your faith tradition. But the whole experience that we'll talk about a little bit later is universal across humans, regardless of faith tradition. The common things we see are what Kelly was talking about. There's an awareness that we're dying. It's called, there's 4 stages. We'll talk about, we have a couple slides on it. We have an awareness that we're dying. And it's interesting. Oftentimes, it's the first time people understand that we are not our body-mind complex. We are not our personality. We're something much, much bigger. And so that separation can feel frightening. I remember being present when that, in the hospital, oftentimes people had that recognition, right? The second thing is you decide there's a phenomenon of feeling like I got to plan something, like I'm going on a trip. Like, think about your sorry. I grew up in the little Einsteins going on a trip, and my favorite rocket ship. Sorry if those of you guys know what I'm talking about. Anyway, it's this. It's like, oh my gosh, this big thing's about to happen. And I don't know what this big thing is. And that flavor can somewhat take on the personality, and that may have a faith tradition piece. The life review thing is very common regardless of background. It's a moral, ethical, universal understanding of love and compassion at its basis, regardless. We even have kids who have come back to tell us this. So it is universal. It's really, really, really interesting. It's like, okay, can we build a curriculum around that? I mean, like, a curriculum for humanity. And then this fourth piece of really wanting to feel like you're at home and whole and fully present. And that is regardless of background. So the only place we see that come into play is some of the flavors of some of the holy beings and lights and things like that we see in that preparatory phase. One piece of information I think is really interesting, little controversial, but interesting, and I think it's important because we're talking about, kind of how can these questions inform not only preparatory, in preparation for dying, but how can inform our living, is that what we understand is that people who have a religious practice actually will elect more aggressive care at the end of life. That's the only thing that we see different with regards to a practice of religion and end of life care, is that people who have a strong religious practice will elect more aggressive care. And we repeated this study 100 different ways to Sunday to make sure that was true. We did it in different disease processes and things like that. So that's the only ICU care, intubation, CPR, all the things. Yeah, so it's a really interesting paradox. Can't explain it. We don't know why, but statistically, that's very true kind of across the board. So when you speak about faith traditions in end-of-life care, that's the only place we really see it. But we see consistency across the recalled experiences of death, and very few experiences related to the faith traditions, but more universally across humanity.
And I want to clarify one thing, because you've said it a couple of times, and I just want to make sure nobody, when you're talking about people coming back, what you're referring to is people who have died and come back after resuscitation. So they've survived and survived their resuscitation and come back and been able to share what they experienced when they were clinically dead.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah.
So just so for those of you who are in the back, Kathy relayed a story. So one of our new kind of ways of being is offering retreats so people can take this information, actually apply it to their own life. We had one last winter, spring, like February, I think it was. We're having another one in November. So keep your eyes peeled for that. And we talked about the shards work. And so Kathy and her partner went home, who were caring for her 98-year-old partner's mom. And they now understood the work that she was doing in picking up shards of her 98 years of life, kind of things, releasing some of her Catholic background, some of the childhood trauma that she had. But it wasn't until the knowledge of what is she doing, right? Could we support her? Because otherwise it feels like, okay, are the drugs doing this? What is this, right? It feels confusing. It feels dementia kind of like, because you're not really living in the present. There's a lot of anxiety sometimes that go with it, confusion, those type of things.
And I think it's really hard, if you know some of those details, to see somebody trying to work through that. And the tendency is to say, oh, Mom, don't worry about that now. Don't think about that now. That's in the past. But what we see over and over is that if you don't deal with it when you're living, you're going to deal with it when you're dying.
Yeah, so what, big important thing that Kathy and Amy and her family have taken away is, don't wait. Conversations need, don't wait until there's a crisis. We always wait for the crisis. Why wait for the crisis? We're creating a crisis for you tonight. Here is your crisis, right? To have these conversations. Oftentimes when we face grief, or even if we're asked to think about our own death, we have these images of what we want at the bedside. Well, that doesn't happen by accident. It's not some magic wand that occurs. If you want a peaceful, loving death, we live as how we die, a peaceful, loving life. And so start invoking some of those things now. Talk to the people that matter most to you about what's important to you. You'd be surprised. So I'm glad.
We've got to move on.
Yeah. Okay, so we'll go to the next question. You guys ready? He's dead. What am I supposed to do now?
People seem to take the moments of death as an emergency. That in all this waiting, in all this preparation, in all this care and everything that happens, and then breathing stops and suddenly it feels like an emergency. And I think that's really common and understandable because now we're in a whole new place. Now this is all different. They were still here a minute ago and now they're gone. And it feels entirely different.
We'll talk about that in a second.
It feels entirely different. And so there's this instant anxiety of what do we do now? What do we do now? If it's a controlled end of life hospice situation, of course, you're not going to call 911. You're not going to do resuscitation. You're not going to initiate any emergency services. But what really has to happen now and what needs to happen in a hurry. So it's an important thing to talk about and to prepare for so that time doesn't come and you just immediately panic. And I've been in so many rooms where we've been called in and said, Dad just stopped breathing. And I'm just putting my stethoscope in my ears and people are on their phones and they're starting to make phone calls and they want to call the funeral home and they just feel this need to do all these things. And it's really it's a period of time to really honor. It is a very, very sacred moment or moments. And to be able to take that breath and honor those times are not only important for those who are left behind, but for that person who is newly dead and their body is still adjusting to that.
Okay, hold your horses because we're going to talk about something that's a little crazy. So going to Dr. Pernia's work, we're going to talk about this new term called the gray zone of death. So, yes? Yeah, we're going to talk about the gray zone of death. Gray zone. And he's English, so it's spelled Grey. Okay. So there's been a lot of work around understanding consciousness. Okay. For simple terms, you have a body. Okay. You also have a mind, and your mind is not your brain, by the way, which is personality, how you take sensory information in, the, kind of processing of your experience. And then you have consciousness. And there is a very large argument about what consciousness is. For those of us who take care of dying people, we see consciousness come in and out of the body all the time. It's the animating force. In our religious traditions, it's called soul. In the Greek traditions, it was called psyche. French, it's élan vital. There's lots of words for it. In the scientific tradition, which is the language I speak, right? So for those of you who are in the scientific tradition, we call it consciousness. And the two sides of the coin is consciousness an emergent property of the brain? The physicalists or the physical reductionists in the scientific tradition believe that it's just an emergent property of the brain. Many of us who work in this realms, including Dr. Pernia, who's an intensivist, believes that consciousness is actually an energetic field for which we are neurobiological receptors for, because of what he calls the recalled experiences of death that we'll talk a little bit more about in a second. And so there's a lot of people studying and trying to solidify this argument that consciousness is a universal field, that if you guys know anything about quantum physics, everything either has a wave or a particle form, depending on if there's an observer involved. And theoretically, we're particles. And when we die, we become waves in very simple terms. And yes, field is outside of us. We're all kind of swimming in it, and we're a particle in this big field. And so that's the argument. It's either emergent property of the brain and we're all individual things that kind of come and go kind of thing, or we're receptors to a field outside of us. In 2018, there was the brain in the bucket experiment. This will jar you, so just a warning shot. There was a team looking at pig brains, and they worked with local butchers and stuff, and they go get decapitated pig heads. They extract the brain, put the brain in a milieu in a bucket, and they were curious if they could reanimate the brain. And they did. Fully. Brains had been decapitated, gone, dead for 4 hours. They put it in a milieu that's, similar to this, kind of blood and saline and things like that. And the brain was reanimated. That was 2018. I'm sure none of you heard about that. It brought up a lot of ethical issues, so much so that the authors of the paper and the science actually blunted their findings. So it remained kind of quiet until recently. And so after 2018, give me 1 second. I'm going to summarize this science because I knew you guys were going to have a lot of questions about this. I'm going to summarize the science and then we can answer all the questions. So then they started looking at humans. No brain in the buckets for humans because they're really concerned about, can you imagine if we reanimated a brain and we have a physical reductionist model, or we have the brain becomes the only place of receiver, is the brain conscious? Can you imagine being conscious and not being able to interact with the world?
And they even worried about that with the pigs. Because
so much so that they sedated
infusion that was circulating through the brain, they eventually added sedatives so that the pigs would not have an opportunity to
have conscious
experience.
And so what they did was they went to the path lab. So people who had died and donated their bodies to science, they started looking at human brains, and they were seeing cellular activity up to 72 hours after the person had died. So there was still activity occurring in these dead tissues. And as a resuscitation scientist, Parnia was like, this is really interesting. And so we're starting to get to this idea of, is death really at the moment the heart and the lungs stop? What's really happening and what's going on? And so they started doing a lot more intensive experiences while people are being resuscitated. So instead of just doing resuscitation, they were throwing EEGs and all sorts of neuroimaging on these people while they're being resuscitated. And what Sam and his colleagues across the globe, because it was a global effort, they found that at the moment of traditional death, and in our world, that is cardiopulmonary death. That's when the heart stops, no breathing, cessation, corneal reflexes are absent. There's no heartbeat, there's no breathing, and actually at that point there is no brain waves. But 30 seconds, consistently, 30 seconds after the moment of cardiopulmonary death, they had a surge of what we call high gamma. So high gamma is the highest level of brain waves a human can experience. It's a highly integrated right brain, left brain, unconscious, conscious. It's like whole brain living that is fostered in meditation and other altered conscious states. We see high gamma trigger 30 seconds after the moment of death, and we're seeing it last somewhat up to 2 hours after that moment of death. And when people are recalled back, either because they've been resuscitated or what have you, they say that they are in a profound, hyper-lucid, hyper-conscious state of love and compassion and understand exactly what's going on. And if you look at ancient traditions and wisdom traditions, they all talk about that the consciousness lingers near the body for hours and sometimes up to days after the event of death. And Sam's work seemingly has proved that. And so, so when we got this information, we sat down as a team at Clare House, and we've talked to other people across the Omega Home Network to kind of say, based on some of what Pema Chodron's work has said, to allow the body to go through the full dying process, allow it to separate and not touch the body for about 30 minutes after the moment of death. When we look at the Buddhist tradition, they actually say at a minimum 20 minutes, but sometimes up to 5 days, depending on the... So we were trying to find if there was a marriage between East and West that could help us. And so we settled at 30 minutes, allowing the body to settle. And one of the most important things that we do is let the person know and remind the person that they've died, because oftentimes they get confused. They're like, I'm still present here. They're in this hyper conscious state near their body, but when, the recalled experiences, if they tell us, they're like, I didn't know. And so it's really important for us to allow the dying process to settle in and to remind those that have died that they actually have died, and to let them go, and allow that time to be sacred, as Kelly said. While you guys are percolating on that, we just listened to a podcast today, or I did. She listened to it the other day, and there's a guy by the name, what's his name?
Sebastian Younger.
Sebastian Younger. He's a war journalist, written a lot. He's a very staunch atheist, and experienced a near-death experience. He didn't quite die, but underwent the process. And when he was coming to, his nurse at the bedside, God love you, nurses. She said, she's like, how are you doing? She's from Boston, and he, Mr. Younger, how you doing? Kind of thing. And she said, it's a remarkable thing. He was talking about the fact that he had actually seen his dad, and he was terrified. He's like, if I'm seeing you, no, I'm not, and was, really terrified about it. And she was just like, she said this remarkable thing to me. She said, instead of thinking about this like something scary, try to think about it as something sacred. Now, as an atheist, this is coming from Younger, I sort of like, claim the right to understand words sacred in secular terms as well. Sorry, this is a transcript. It's not translating well, but it's just it's not just the domain of the faithful. And for me, something sacred, sacred information, sacred knowledge, sacred task is anything that helps people live their lives with more dignity, with less pain, with less fear, more love, more connection. Anything that does that is a sacred process. Yes. Please. I would be remiss in understanding fully what was going on, but it, kind of the brains were it infused in the bucket and of themselves. What electrical impulses they did, I'm not sure. That would be something, and Sam doesn't even go into the book, but it was hooked up to monitors, and after being infused, appeared to come back to life.
And it was a continual infusion of this formula that they sort of created.
Mimic blood, essentially.
And there were some of these experiments where the brain actually continued, it grew.
Yeah, continued to cellularly divide. Yeah, it was, yeah.
Yeah, it was mimicking circulation.
Yep. And one of the things that we know that it's really circulation, it's circulating oxygenated solutions and things like that, is that's some of the work that's being done to do resuscitation now is really mimicking this idea. There's a thing called ECMO, which is kind of like bypass, to help people resuscitate, to mimic some of this science, to help preserve brains and things like that for people who have the propensity to come back. So, yeah.
So for this ignorant brain, could you please share what mildew and reanimate?
Yeah. So basically think of a bucket. think of solution that's a blood-like, that's rich in minerals, and that's milieu, minerals, oxygen, things that we like, that's like blood-like, and it's submerged in that milieu, essentially. And after having it circulated through the brain, through arteries and veins like that, and they had electrical monitoring on it, and then they sent it through a scanner, it looked like it was alive. So when you look at the images from the brain in the bucket versus a live pig brain, the scientists couldn't tell the difference between the two of them. We have just opened either a great door or a can of worms. We don't know yet, right? Depending on the ethicists in the room. Yes, kind of stroke care, traumatic brain injuries, particularly hypoxic events, so people that go down because of a cardiac arrest. This could change things significantly.
And I think how Dr. Parnia talked about it was for people that weren't supposed to die.
Right.
So somebody with end-stage metastatic cancer, this would not be a solution for restoring life
Right.
for them. But for somebody that had some kind of traumatic accident event in some way that could be repaired, it might
Right.
be an option.
Yeah. In clinical medicine right now, right? Death is so that's why gray zone of death now, that it's not a demarcated when the heart stops, when the lungs stop, and or we have declared brain death because we have no EEGs, right? We have no brain waves and things like that. That's the question, right? It becomes kind of, when is somebody really dead? And so that's what this science is really challenging, is at what point ethically does harvesting organs come into play, right? That's usually the very first question. The most interesting thing, though, is that if you go on to Sam's lab at NYU, actually has a video and then like a movie around the book. So if you're not interested in reading the book, you can get most of it through the movie. One of the people that he interviews for the book is one of the foremost leaders in transplant medicine in the United States, because he died 7 times and had 7 recalled experiences of death on his own and underwent cardiac transplant. So he's sitting as part of this whole thing, not only from the clinical side, but also the patient side. So it's pretty cool. Yeah, so Lisa was talking about a lot of the work that's happening in end-of-life care. Some of you may have heard the term doula, very similar to midwifery. And the legal ramifications of having a body in your home or in a setting. What is the legal ramifications? Oftentimes, we have minutes, hours, days, or whatever. In Oklahoma, it's 3 days in a home. You can care for a body before the legal kind of concerns come up. And so that, I think that's a lot of what we're now thinking about is, kind of this gray zone that we now know about. When you know better, you do better. Not that I want to quote Oprah or anybody, but, it's one of those things that's what we're dealing with now is, how long can we allow this process to occur, create this sacred space so that the process can completely unfold in its own time. I think it's really cool that the scientific tradition is now coming back to the, closer to the humanistic side and really giving people language and understanding about really what's happening in our own terms so that we can appropriately make decisions in the best interest of our patients.
And when I first heard about this study and started reading Lucid Dying, I would have to stop every so often because I would think, I'm not sure I want to know this. I'm not sure that this is how I want reality to be. But even if you have to take it in small doses, learning about a different way to perceive and experience life is pretty cool. It's hard sometimes to let go of everything you've believed your whole life about what might be happening, but there's so much opportunity for more growth, for more knowledge, for just embracing a different kind of living.
One last question, and then we'll. Yeah, that's a great question. So the question for those of you who couldn't hear, did I hear you say not to touch the body? What is the reason behind it? Would it cause agitation? So one, the brain, when it goes into this hyper lucid state, the thought is that it's releasing braking mechanisms that our personality puts into place, right? So right now, the amount of information that your nervous system is having to process is ungodly, right? Billions of pieces of data are coming into you at any given time. And depending on your life circumstances, you have programming that, is like the Plinko machine in your brain where it like what's going to get through and what isn't, kind of thing. And we live in a like microscopic, very narrow version of what we could potentially be. We have braking systems that our brains put on to kind of deal with the amount of information. And in this period of time, all brakes are off, including genetic potentialities of what we call auto-resuscitation, meaning fetal kind of things get turned on, all sorts of things get turned on that are quieted during normal life. And so some people could auto-resuscitate. We call it the Lazarus effect, for those of you who know Lazarus' story. And so when we want the dying process to settle in and help our loved ones say, we love you, we miss you, you've died, and remind them, because they're still, based on this data, they're still floating around in and around the body, and helping them remember that they've died and that it's okay to go and, peace out. I'll see you in the next world, kind of thing, is really important. For those who are staunch atheists, don't believe in an afterlife, there is this energetic experience that we now can read and understand, and helping people understand that, they've died, say goodbye, and those type of things is still very important. So we're going to do a little bit of an exercise. One of the things that's really interesting when you look at, I'm just going to turn it on. You guys can watch it while I'm talking. This is from a meditation team up in Canada called Awaken the World. I think they're amazing. When you look at these recalled experiences of death, and you look at the ancient traditions, there's lots of them. Many of our ancient traditions actually talk about this liminal space that high gamma is articulating in the scientific tradition. What's happening in these moments after the period of death? And one of the things that Pema Chodron's book talks about is what they call the bardos in the Buddhist tradition. So B-A-R-D-O. Bardo just means passage, transition, gap. There's different bardos, and in the Buddhist tradition, they believe that each one of the bardos represents an opportunity for you to become enlightened. And each one of them has a color that's kind of associated with it. There's red, white, and black are the primary ones in the first periods. Sometimes you see purple, sometimes you see green, sometimes you see blue, depending on kind of your proclivities and parts of your personality and your karma and all the things that the Buddhists talk about. But we thought it was really interesting how there's similarities, and we see things that are shared across humanity. And I was telling Kelly about the Bardo stuff. I was just like, God, I wonder what this really means and everything. She's like, oh, I remember this poem. And so we wanted to give you, that's a lot of information, and it may be really jarring for people, particularly if you have a visual. When I first read the brain in a bucket thing, I was like, okay, I'm putting this down right now. It was very Frankensteinian. So we wanted to give you a little bit of a break to allow that to sink in. So just get yourselves kind of comfortable. If you want to, you can put things on the floor. But this is just a little bit of a sweet meditative exercise to talk about a poem, because as we said earlier, yes, your loved one who's dying is wading into the gray zone of death, but so are you. And so there's, kind of vacillating back and forth between those that are moving on and those that remain.
So this is the experience of someone grieving. See me red with anger, out of control, life's unpredictableness shaking me. How could he die? I lash out at those who make life more difficult, those on the other end of a business phone call who don't understand, who make no effort to be kind. Those who call asking for his things, not out of memory but out of greed. How selfish and rude. I scream the words silently. Even cards can make me see red. I know you're strong, they say. I know I am, but please, let me be weak. Just for now, just for a moment. See me green, taking control. My house will be in order. The living room will be vacuumed and dusted. The yard will be mowed, weeded, and watered. I laugh at myself, yet understand the need to be in control. And those around me, they're amused, I'm sure, but happy to oblige and plunge into the work beside me. See me blue, lonely, missing him, needing him by my side, yearning for his presence, heart aching with a pain unknown before. But now a constant companion, crushing pain. I can't breathe. I rub my chest to no avail. The pain remains. See me purple in a sea of tears, sobbing. The waves of despair roll in. The pain in my heart becomes knife-like. I think I cannot bear it another moment. Then mercifully the tide recedes. See me yellow, calm, exhausted. The knowledge of the goodness of our love flows into me. I become aware that it is for eternity. The memories, special and precious, a treasure box of all we had, all we were together. His words forever imprinted in his journal, an ongoing gift, telling me over and over again of his love for me, his sweet companion. See me black in the darkness. I am alone. I sink into nothingness, a void. No one can go home. Oh, it's so cold. It's so black. I cry out loud. It's black. I'm cold. And oh God, I'm afraid. Arms hold me and cradle me. A candle is lit to bring me back to the light, to safety, to see white without feeling, too tired to feel, too overwhelmed to care anymore. If I care and remember, the other colors will return. I don't have the energy to be touched by the colors. Oh, the rainbow, how it surrounds me, bringing an awareness of both the heights and depths of joy and sorrow. How I love the peaks, how I avoid the valleys, and yet the valley gives me a beautiful view of the peak. If I can only open my swollen eyes to see and bask in the glow of the colors.
Last question of the evening. Is a sudden chaotic death different? We're going to open this with a colleague of ours.
My husband's death was anything but planned or even anticipated. One evening when he was home by himself, he started having some chest pain, texted me to let me know about that, and then encouraged me to get home. I did, and it was obvious he was having a heart attack. He was taken to a hospital, and he was alive. It didn't kill him suddenly, but we got to the hospital. They got him stabilized, and I was like, things are going to be fine. Things are going to be fine. This is something we hadn't planned on, call into work, all of that. And then he arrested, and the doctors worked with him and got him back. The doctors, it felt like that there was no reason to be alarmed. Just before he arrested, he was starting to have some trouble breathing. And I would think at that point was the first time he realized that he was going to not make it. I still felt like that the medicine or medical community wouldn't fail him and that he would be fine. He looked at me and said, "I'm dying." And I was like, no, you're not. They're gonna take care of you. And then, as I said, he arrested. They got him back, gonna do some testing and whatever. Then he arrested again. By that time, my son had arrived, and before he could actually get to the area where we were in the hospital, my husband arrested yet again. That was 3 times. I'm a nurse. I know that life is not sustainable forever. And luckily, my husband and I had discussed prior to this, many years before actually, what would we do? What would we want to have done? Now, had we written it down and done a formal thing? No, but we had discussed it, and we discussed it with our children, that if it was a situation where life was not going to be something that would be sustainable, or if we were to be brought back and life would not have the quality that we wanted, that the other person had the right to say, okay, let's just stop the treatment. So I asked the doctor, we've done this 3 times, how much longer can we expect there to be any kind of good result? And he said, well, let me look at some of the test results. And he came back and said, the only thing keeping his heart beating is the medication we're giving him. And so I looked at my son and I looked at the doctor and I said, then stop it. He does not want to live like that. And my son was right on board with it as well. The doctor went in, they stopped the medication, and within just a few minutes, he was gone. I was thankful we'd had those discussions. I was sorry after seeing how Clare House takes care of families that we hadn't had the time to prepare, to know that it was coming, to be supported by hospice people. So I encourage people nowadays that that's something that they need to be thinking about. Have those discussions. For myself afterwards, it was a big shock. I didn't know what to do next. We didn't have that support there. The hospital didn't have that. They had lost a patient and on they moved to other patients, which is totally understandable, but for me, I was left hanging. So I would say that a sudden death for the person is going to be different from person to person. My husband didn't really experience much, but wow, my family and I did. My daughter lives in New York. We were keeping in touch with her via text. At one point when we told her that he had arrested, but they were working on him, she was like, oh good, he'll be fine. But unfortunately that was not the case. And again, she did not have the time to prepare for knowing what was coming. So preparation is definitely important.
So, to answer the question, this is the work from Sam's lab that lays out those 4 pieces that I talked about earlier and were called experiences of death. And when we have traumatic deaths, so people who've been in car accidents, they come back and say, time collapses. And they go through this exact same thing. They will watch the experience unfold, their death unfold. They can tell you in a 360-degree sensory experience. So it's not the limited sensory experience that we have, but like just this whole field that, kind of that they are aware, like they can see, hear, smell, taste, touch, the field in and around their body, and then some. And they go through this process. They know, oh, I'm dying. I've separated from my body some way, shape, or form. They're watching what's going on. Sometimes people immediately start having these experiences of bright lights and tunnels that you typically hear about. They will have beings, whether they're loved ones or otherwise, come and visit and kind of say, let's go. People will undergo this life review and watch all of this happening all at the same time. And so the time-space continuum collapses. And there's a point where they get recalled back, and some people don't. But they all have this feeling of understanding that there is something much, much bigger and unified about our experiences, and that, kind of this one blip of a life, this one particle of a life is short. And in in the much bigger scheme of things is what they tell us. And so, having had loved ones in my own life die traumatically, I will tell you this gives me a lot of solace. And to have scientific tradition give us some data that says that actually is true is heartwarming for me. So.
It is such a vastly different experience for survivors than an expected death due to a progressive illness or something that you know coming. Maybe it's been going on for 2 weeks or 2 months, but there is something so different about an instant death, about a traumatic accident, and that impact on survivors can be so very different because of, as Marla talked about, their lack of ability to prepare, to feel like they had a chance to do any of those things that we feel like are so much a part of the work that happens at Clare House every day, of reconciling relationships, creating a legacy, taking care of business, just being present and spending time with loved ones. That's the gift of time that a prolonged process can give you, is that people can actually do this work that adds meaning to their life and to their death and provides comfort and passes on that wisdom to their survivors. And sometimes people feel robbed of that opportunity when death comes suddenly. But you juxtapose that with what we talked about last week, with this prolonged period of why is it taking so long? We treat our animals better than this. Why is death so slow in coming? And those are just the extremes that we deal with in this universal life experience.
I think when I get asked this question, there are a lot of philosophical and religious practices that talk about how to grieve, how to experience grief. And one of the most, I think, tactical, practical things that I've heard is saying the things out loud to your loved one that you didn't get to say. Whatever that is. Okay, remind them again, you've died. It was traumatic. I'm feeling this, and this. But one of the practices we did last week, I think, is really, really helpful. It's a call and receive of compassion. Please give me your fears. Please give me your distress, your shame, your loneliness. Give me those things so that it can be transformed, and I send you my love. And doing that for a period of time. We hear about the 90 days of grief and grieving and things like that. There's something to that. There's a little bit something to that, but grief is always with you. It's just learning how to deal with it. And so in that acute stage, those a few, days, weeks, and months after the event, to have a practice of compassion, giving and receiving compassion, and saying the things that you need to say to your loved one, I think is really important, regardless if it's a traumatic death or otherwise. Some people say that you read some of the traditions about moving on to the next life, whether that's biblical or otherwise, reading verses that resonate, or poems or things to your loved one in that period of time, not only allows the grief for you to come up, you can then begin grieving because you have felt it. Great question. So question was asked, what's it like when someone comes in with the fancy word for is death anxiety, right? Or fear of death. And someone who has some mortality salience has prepared for this, what's the kind of difference? There's a lot of, it's what counseling happens. People can have these transcendent moments regardless of what they come in prepared for. And all of a sudden you had somebody who had a fear of death and now doesn't. With rare exception, everybody experiences the going home piece. It may not be pretty. There may be respiratory issues because the body is struggling, but there seems to be this release that happens in the hours and minutes prior to the event of death, regardless of what's going in. The dealing with the life review sometimes can be a little bit different, but death opens us to those transcendent moments, and oftentimes even within the fear of death, they kind of manage it, particularly if they are in community and in a place where they feel safe. So,
And again, when people are afforded the luxury of time and they come in with those stresses, with issues, with anxieties, there is that's the beauty of a loving, healing environment, and that healing does and can frequently happen even in the last hours, days, and certainly weeks of life in a supportive, loving environment that is infused with compassion. And that happens all the time in our house. We witness that every day, that something is healed, something that someone's carried has been let go or put down, and there's healing that can occur. And it's just such a huge opportunity for growth, for peace, for
Yeah.
preparation.
I mean, I think it's really important about context, right? We created context for the content of someone's life to unfold. And, you know, we're trying to do that for people in our own home, but also teaching people how to do that while they're living.
And we're never trying to create a storybook image of what it's like. It's not like what you see on TV. It's not a Hallmark movie at Clare House, or in people's homes at
It's messy.
bedsides. It's messy. It's gritty. It's real, but it's wonderful in such weird ways.
Well, we are at time. Thank you all for being here. Thank you all for engaging in the conversation. Kelly and I will hang out here for a little bit to answer any other questions, but please feel free to reach out to us.